Applause. At high noon, the town of Redstone suffocated under sweltering heat, red dust, and the roar of a crowd. Townsfolk packed tight around the old barnyard, their eyes fixed on the new swinging overhead. Dangling from it was a giant Apache woman, tall and broad-shouldered like a pillar of stone, her solid frame trembling under the sun. Her bare feet kicked weakly. Bruises wrapped around her throat, but her eyes still blazed, not with fear, not with tears, but with defiance. The mob screamed, "Hang her! Let the monster die!" A sneering deputy clutched the rope, treating the scene like it was a circus show. Just then, a weathered wagon rolled to a stop. At the reins sat a lone rancher. His coat was worn and dusty, his gray eyes hardened by years. He had only come into town to buy salt, a few nails, and a sack of coffee. But what he saw made his hands grip the reins tighter. He knew the choice before him. Walk away, and he'd spend the night alone again by the fire, sipping bitter coffee while a strong spirit choked to death behind him. Step in, and the whole town would brand him a traitor. That moment stretched the length of a single breath. The giant Apache woman tilted her head, locking eyes with him. She did not beg, she dared him. The rancher drew his knife. One clean, cold stroke. The rope snapped. The crowd froze in stunned silence. The massive woman dropped to the ground, gasping for breath. The rancher stood tall, still in his eyes, knowing full well. From this moment on, there was no turning back. A rough cough burst from her lungs as the giant woman hit the ground. She dropped to her knees, rope burns deep across her neck, her breath hissing like hot coals. Chaos erupted across the square. Some reached for their guns. Others screamed, "Hold her down. Don't let that lunatic steal her." Deputy Morrison shoved through the crowd, a shining Colt in hand. He shouted, "Coulter, do you even know what you just did? That savage was meant to die, and you just kicked dirt in the face of the law." The rancher stepped forward, eyes cold as iron. He pulled his Winchester free, fired a single shot into the sky. The crack thundered through the plaza. Horses reared, and the crowd scattered, cursing, but backing off. Morrison glared, but didn't dare fire in a square full of witnesses. "Fine," he spat, "take her. But know this, tonight I'm coming. Me and the whole damn town." The rancher didn't answer. He turned, lifted the towering woman into the wagon. She staggered, her bare feet leaving tiny trails of blood in the dust. Jeers still rang out. Rocks clattered off the wheels. The wagon rolled away from the square. Behind them, Morrison gripped his pistol tighter, eyes blazing. The whole town of Redstone watched, knowing full well that lone rancher had just lit the fuse to a bloody war. On the road back, cold wind cut through the air. From time to time, the rancher glanced at the woman beside him. She did not cry. She did not tremble. Her eyes remained forward, sharp, and steady, as if the noose had only made her stronger. The lone cabin came into view at the bottom of a long hill, small, weathered, but stubborn against the vast prairie. The rancher stopped the wagon and helped her down. She brushed off his hand, limping on her own wounded, but proud. That night, inside the wooden walls, fire crackled in the hearth. Wind howled outside like wolves on the ridge. The rancher sat by the door, gun across his lap. The giant Apache woman sat silently near the flames, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Both knew one thing for certain. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Dawn settled over the ranch with a pale light, cold as sharpened steel. The rancher had been up for hours, his worn boots sinking into the dew-soaked earth as he inspected the fence line. The night wind had snapped a few posts, sagging the wire cattle could break loose at any moment. He drove his shovel into the dirt, ready to lift a new post when the giant figure appeared behind him. The Apache woman, rope burned, still bruising her neck, approached without a word. Quietly, She bent down and lifted the full-length log he had been struggling with. Muscles rippled down her arms as she set it into the hole as if it were nothing more than a branch. The rancher paused, surprised. He was used to the hollow eyes of the rescued, grateful, timid, broken. But not here. Here was strength, unspoken, and unmoved. All morning they worked side by side without a word. He pulled the wire taut. She held the post. He swung the hammer. She handed him nails. When the sun rose high and sweat ran down his brow, he offered the canteen. She took a sip and passed it back, her eyes meeting his without flinching. Their language was labor, not speech. Inside the cabin, silence ruled as well. The rancher built a fire, boiled a thin soup from dry beans. He set a bowl in front of her. She ate slowly, her eyes fixed more on the flames than on him. That night, she didn't sleep in the narrow bed. She sat with her back to the wall, eyes open until morning like a sentinel. The rancher lay listening to the wind cut through the cabin walls, knowing full well she hadn't slept either. The next day, he found a gate hinge loose on the barn. Before he could fetch the hammer, she stepped forward, picked up the fallen pin, and drove it back into place with a few sharp blows. She didn't look at him. Didn't expect thanks. The rancher stood still, and in that quiet moment, he understood. She wasn't here to be rescued. She was here to survive on her own terms. That evening, in the golden firelight, the rancher tapped the body of his Winchester, listening to the wind rush over the open plains. The woman sat near the hearth, her deep eyes glowing red in the reflection of the fire. Still silent, still distant, but no longer strangers, it was the silence of those who knew. Sometimes survival needs no words, only someone who will stand beside you when the ground begins to shake. That afternoon, the western sky was a dull gray, heavy as a pan of ash. Wind churned in swirling gusts, sweeping dust and sand across the plains. The rancher hurried to bolt the windows, herd the animals into their stalls, and locked the cabin tight. The wind screamed through the cracks like cutting blades. Inside by the flickering firelight, the silhouette of the Apache woman sat still as a statue. The flames swept across her sunched face, the rope's bruises still etched on her neck, her unblinking gaze fixed on the darkness. The rancher sat nearby at the table, quietly cleaning his Winchester. And then, for the first time, her voice cut the silence, raspy like a pebble rolling at the bottom of a canyon. "Why did you save me?" The rancher looked up, pausing for a moment. He had grown used to her silence after days of speechless labor. Forgotten that she had a voice at all, he answered quietly, his tone stiff as old wood, because no one else the reed. She turned toward him, fire, not of fragility, but of defiance burning in her eyes. Slowly, her words dropped like heavy stones. "It was my own people who hung me." The rancher froze. Outside, the wind paused for a beat, as if to let her words settle. She explained. She had once been a warrior in her tribe, so strong that even mounted Apache scouts held back. But when she refused, a marriage arranged with the chief's son, the tribe saw it as disgrace. One night, she was captured bound, and it was her own kin who had twisted the noose around her neck. The townspeople had merely carried out a sentence already passed. The rancher remained silent, his grip tight on the gunstock. He understood now that he hadn't only saved a life, he had stepped into an age-old conflict between worlds. His own white township and the Apache people outside. Hooves echoed faintly, then vanished on the wind. The rancher stepped to the porch, eyes scanning the rising dust line. Fresh hoof prints marked the ground. Someone had been watching the ranch through the storm. He turned back inside, eyes meeting those steely ones belonging to the towering woman. No words were exchanged, but they both knew the hanging night was only the beginning. There would be others, more men, hungrier, angrier coming back for her. "Thank you so much for being here." If this story brings back memories of the old days, the red dusty afternoons, the sound of horses' hooves echoing in your heart, subscribe to my channel so that every day we can sit together and I can tell you another Western story. That night, the wind had fallen silent, but the air outside remained heavy like a dark blanket pressed against the prairie. The rancher sat in his wooden chair, his Winchester resting across his lap. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. The giant Apache woman sat motionless by the door, her posture straight, her large hands resting on her knees as still and silent as a statuesque guardian. Then came the thunder of hooves in the distance, slow, heavy echoes. A torch flickered, then another, until a line of fiery red lights flickered closer, like a line of hunting beasts drawing near. The rancher stood, his fingers tightening on the rifle's grip. The woman moved, too, her eyes alight with fire. Outside, a voice roared, "Open the door, Coulter. Bring out that monster, and you may yet live." The rancher recognized Deputy Morrison's voice, the same man who had sneered at him earlier in the town square. Now Morrison returned with 8 armed men, torches blazing, surrounding the cabin like ravenous wolves. "You know she's not human. She's a monster. She'll kill you in your sleep," Morrison howled, voice cracking like dry wood through the slats of the door. The rancher answered in a low, growly tone, "Tonight, whoever crosses this fence will not live to see tomorrow." A crack of gunfire split the silence. Wood splintered from the cabin wall. The rancher yanked the giant Apache woman down to the floor, pressing her body low. But fear didn't flicker in her eyes. Instead, she growled softly and seized the heavy chopping axe. With a mighty shove, she burst through the side door like a whirlwind. One sweeping blow knocked a torch from a man's hand, the fire swiping across his face. Chaos erupted. The rancher rushed out beside her, firing 2 shots from his Winchester. 2 attackers went down in the dust. Morrison screamed and whipped his horse back. Yet he still bellowed, "Surround them. Burn this camp to the ground." A can of oil smashed against the cabin's wall, flaring into flame. The rancher lunged forward, beating the blaze with a blanket, sweat pouring from his forehead. The giant woman stood guard at his side, her axe swinging wide. Each blow forced the gunman back. In the firelight, she looked like a legend come to life. The fighting raged through the night. Only at dawn, when the Ruers' call broke the tension, did the attackers retreat, leaving behind smoke, horse bodies, and blood-stained earth. Morrison vanished into the breaking dawn, hurling a final taunt. "You won't hold her for long, Coulter." Inside the cabin, surrounded by ashes and debris, the rancher collapsed to the floor, breath ragged. The Apache woman set her axe down. Her chest heaved, but her gaze remained as cold and steady as steel. No words were spoken, but both understood. The real battle had only just begun. Dawn broke after a night of flames. The sun filtered through a haze of dust, illuminating the grassland, still marked with hoof prints and dried blood. The rancher stood on the porch of the cabin, fingers resting on the stock of his Winchester, eyes shadowed by sleepless exhaustion. Beside him, the giant Apache woman sat unmoving, her axe planted deep in the ground like a spear guarding the threshold. Then from the horizon, dust swirled and hooves sounded in the distance. First sparse, then gathering in fierce rhythm. 30 Apache riders appeared, their dark horses glistening in the rising sun. They formed a half-circle, closing in on the small homestead. Leading them was an elder chieftain, his hair stray with gray, his face carved with hardship. He raised a ceremonial staff high, his voice deep and resonant. "My warrior, you should have died. Why are you still alive?" The giant turned slowly to stand, her neck still bruised from the rope, her eyes burning bright. She didn't look at the rancher, nor did she bow to her own people. Her voice was hoarse, but clear with determination, "Because I did not bow, not to the noose, not to the men who thought they could own me. Murmurs rippled through the riders. Some rested hands on their spears. Others lowered their heads as if struck. The chieftain's voice was grave. You defied your people, refused the marriage alliance, brought shame upon your father. Now you stand with the white man. Choose. Return and face judgment, or die here. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the wind rustling through dried grass. The rancher tightened his grip on the rifle, ready to fire the first shot. Yet the giant placed a steady hand on his arm. She stepped forward, towering alone amid 30 horses. I will not return. I choose to stay. Not for the land, not for this wooden cabin, but because here, for the first time, I am seen as a person. Her words echoed louder than the approaching hooves. The chieftain studied her in silence. Finally, he lowered his staff, turned his horse. Then bear that choice. We will no longer protect you. One by one, the 30 riders withdrew, leaving the grasslands eerily silent. The rancher exhaled hard, a cold sweat dampening his shirt. The giant Apache woman turned to him, her gaze still fierce, but now softened by a flicker of warmth. The choice had been made. There was no going back. The afternoon after the 30 riders withdrew, the pasture before the cabin lay quiet, eerie in its stillness. Only the wind whispered through warped fence boards, and a lone hen clucked, startled from the previous night's chaos. The rancher swept up scattered ashes in the yard, shoulders aching and hands raw from splintered wood cutting into his skin. The giant Apache woman sat by the porch, the bruise on her neck had darkened further, but her gaze tracked the rancher's every move, not with the weary glint of early days, but with the steady warmth of shared purpose. When the rancher began repairing the fence, she walked over without being asked. Wordlessly, her massive hands lifted a full log and set it into the hole. He looked up and offered a faint knowing smile. For the first time in years, the cabin wasn't a lonely fortress, but a home held together by shared work. That night, inside the quiet cabin, the rancher pulled out a small, dust-covered wooden box. Inside lay a string of old beads, the tribal chief's heirloom once passed down through her lineage. When she fled, the chief had left them on the porch, a silent severing of bonds. The rancher picked up the beads, dusted them gently, and placed them on the table. The giant Apache woman stared, her hands trembling slightly before slowly taking the beads. She didn't cry, but her breath caught. Moments later, she rested her calloused hand upon the rancher's. If I stay, she said softly, it is my choice, no one else's. The rancher nodded without words. He pulled an old cradle close to the hearth and placed the bead necklace upon it. In the fire's glow, the beads sparkled like tiny stars, symbols of a new beginning. That night they sat long by the fire. Neither rescuer nor rescued, they were two souls bearing scars of the past and bound by a decision. From now on, their fates would be entwined. Outside, wind swept across the endless plains. Inside, the firelight pulled around them, merging their shadows on the wooden wall into the shape of one towering figure. Steady, strong, and defiant enough to face the world. The harsh winter passed slowly, leaving shattered ice along the creek and smoky ash staining the cabin walls. But with Macha's return came sunlight that spilled across the prairie like warm honey. The ice melted and parts of green grass pushed up from the wet earth, telling proof that even death cannot hold the whole world forever. The rancher stepped out onto the porch, his boots sinking into the soggy mud, arms carrying a bundle of new fence posts. Behind him, the giant Apache woman followed, erect and resolute against the clear sky. She lifted each post effortlessly and set it into the ground like she was placing a tree into the earth itself. He secured the wire. She held the post steady. Together they worked in rhythm, their actions interlocked like long familiar gears. Occasionally, townsfolk rode by, stopping in the distance to glance at the homestead. No one dared come near. After the siege on the cabin and the arrival of 30 Apache riders, the rancher's name had become synonymous with the man who aimed his gun at the world just to protect the woman labeled a monster. But in his eyes, she was no monster. She was a warrior. Proof that survival can grow into a home given someone willing to share the burden. One evening, the rancher sat by the newly built cradle, his fingers brushing the beads resting upon it. Beside him, she stood silent. Her gaze was distant, but no longer cold. Then she spoke softly. Back then they bound me to kill me. Today I choose to bind myself. With this string of beads, he turned toward her, the steel-gray sadness in his eyes calming. Gently, he replied, that rope lifted you to death. But this string keeps you tethered to life. She lowered her head and placed her large hand over his. In that moment, every wound, every prejudice, every grudge seemed to dissolve. As dusk fell, red golden light spilled across the prairie. Wind stirred the dust, but this time it carried the scent of new grass and rebirth. The rancher gazed toward the horizon, whispering to himself, the day I cut that rope was the day I cut the shackles from my own heart. And so, in the wild frontier, a lone rancher and a towering Apache warrior had found a bond stronger than death, a bond of choice, of trust, and of freedom. Closing message, preserving the voice and warmth. In the West, not every bullet defines fate. Sometimes a single rope cut at the right moment frees two people, one from death, the other from loneliness. And maybe what we hold most dearly to the end is the right to choose to stay together. My deepest wish is that all of you live in joy and fulfillment. That has always been my hope. Please accept that. I love you, my dear, honored audience. Let me know how this story touched you by dropping a comment below.